All right, everybody. Good morning. Happy Tuesday. Hope you all are having a good summer. My standard greetings to you as always. Meant to do a stream yesterday, but was too busy on the back end with my charts as well as this morning. Again, that's why I can't host many of them on my website because I'm changing things all the time for the stream. But I got some interesting ones today. Very, very interesting. So let me put on the charts and let's get right to it. Here's the old power curve. Nothing new here if you've been following my work. Only into the model from July 6th, so 2 days ago, but literally right on trend. Okay. If you want to call this fair value, call it fair value. I think it's hard to say what is actual fair value, but there is a trend. There are many different ways to value things, obviously. Using the power curve and multiples and trend lines is one way to do it. Seeing a little bit of despair, summer despair, people wondering where the God candles are. I tend to think that, as usual, markets are going to swing, the pendulum's going to swing, and it's just not going to go up on the same curve forever at the, every single day. That would be 100% R squared. Bitcoin's a 96% R squared, so that's why you get moves like this. All right, into the Goldilocks zone, the 90th percentile and above, which usually takes 3 or 4 months max before it falls back out of that zone. This is the green, counting the green days above 90th percentile right there. You see the green price, and then the green mountain there is days. I think it's going to happen again. But what I have been talking about in prior streams recently is this idea of how Bitcoin is a network. Bitcoin grows in power. All right, it grows in power in time. Nothing else does. All right, stocks, bonds, ETFs, gold, money, all of that grows exponentially. Exponential has a problem, though, in that usually, not always, but usually, you reach a situation where the system gets unstable and some paradigm shift happens. The math becomes too strong. I think that probably happened during the old debt jubilees in ancient times. Probably happened during some collapse of empires in medieval times. There's no way necessarily to know when that collapse or that paradigm shift when we move into a different system. For example, when we moved from gold to fiat, which really was a process that took like 100 years. Now let's say 60 years, from 1914 to 1971. That was a paradigm shift. We're now experimenting with fiat only. We have Bitcoin coming in, could be another paradigm shift. But here's my question, and I've been talking about this a lot, and I think it's a really, really interesting one that no one is answering. In every paradigm shift that we had in the history of the world, we were usually moving from exponential to exponential. So whether it was silver to gold or gold to fiat or some old gold standard to a new gold standard, the system itself was always growing exponentially. And that just simply means constantly. Constantly 2% per year, 3% per year, 7% per year. That's what I'm measuring right now if you add up fiat-based money and gold. So you get a situation that looks like this, all right? This is TradFi-based money. Talked about this before, all right? Zoom in. This is clearly exponential growth. This is log scale. Lower left to upper right looks pretty much like a straight line. I'm not even drawing the trend lines. Let's keep it very, very simple. But I do have the trend line when you extend it out. All right, so this is the trend line. On this chart, again, I'm always changing things, but I'll tell you exactly the R squared, just so you know. On this chart, this trend line, which grows at 7.3% per year, the R squared is 93%. Pretty good. Pretty good. Exponential fit, 93%. All right. And you can also graph the constant growth right here. Okay. I could show actual trailing 12-month growth would be up, which would be up, would be down at this point, but I'm just keeping it extremely simple. This is what you would call the slope of the trend, 7.3% per year compounded. All right, this number, this 43 trillion, is your unbacked monetary base, which is just all central bank money, minus your gold and Bitcoin reserves. There's about 15 billion in Bitcoin reserves, plus available gold, plus available silver. It's all money past and present. It's my sort of Bitcoin dominance index. But we have the situation where if you draw base money or any asset, which I'm about to show you here, which makes it more interesting, on log linear, just log, basic log scale, you get a straight line. But what we have clearly established, I think, myself and a lot of the folks from the power crew or the power law crew, Bitcoin intelligence people, Giovanni, Money or Debt, Stephen, is that what happens here, if you graph Bitcoin over time, you get what looks as this sort of slightly asymptotic concave down trend line. All right, here's the trend line. It's a 96% R squared. Okay, so an even better fit than this fit, which I'm not showing you on the tooltip, but it's 93% R squared. Let's put them together. I've shown this a lot. All right, so here, this is a monthly frequency. Let's look at the Bitcoin network now in power. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Okay, here we go. Talked about this. It seems to me that we'll meet somewhere around 155 trillion. And even though fiat money grows at a constant 7.3% per year in this metric, all right? This is the straight line, the straight dotted line. Notice, by the way, how flat the actual money supply looks compared to Bitcoin. Right? So you can see the growth is slower. It's a shallower curve here. If we would graph Bitcoin's trailing 12-month growth rate, it's extremely fast at the beginning. This is this power curve growth, all right? Thousands of percent in 2010, 2011, based on the price chart. And this is actually based on the trend of the market cap. Gradually falling down to where we are today, about 46, 45%. Again, this is the difference between price and market cap. Price is going to be closer to 42% by the end of the year. Market cap is 44. But we're way faster than fiat. All right. So if I would just, let's put on the fiat growth now. Let's take everything off and just look at this. No, I'm going to have to put them all back on. Let's go log. Take this off. This is what I've showed before a lot. Now, I've extended this chart now out to the end of the century. Before I had it, I think in 2050. You see the flipping occurs somewhere here. Okay, this is just a coincidence that that crosses right there. The flipping is right here. You put a dominance index, you see that it's creeping towards 100% right there, right? This is where it flips, around 2043. Now, Bitcoin grows so much faster than the way that money grows that we don't really have to think about anything else. Like, it's obviously when sats become a standard, when the world is thinking in Bitcoin terms, things will change. But the question that I have been positing to this stream is, how will contracts work in the business world? Because TradFi is still, the way that money is growing is still going to chug along at that 7% per year, presumably. Okay. Obviously, I'm pricing this in dollars. Things are going to change. Let's just look at the percentages now. All right, here it is. Okay, so we came from the early years, thousands of percent with Bitcoin. This is where we are today, just so you can see how fast Bitcoin is growing still, 46%. But that is declining. That is declining because that's the nature of power growth over time, which is what Bitcoin does. So we have to wait all the way till nearly the end of the century to cross here. Now, you could say this is too far in the future. Who knows? But this was the question that I was asking. The world thinks in terms of this line, constant growth. All right. The reason we get a straight line, I'm looking at the solid green now, the solid green. The reason we can go from 43 trillion, all right, growing every 7.3%, that means it's going to double in 10 years. Okay, so let's go to 2035. Doubled exactly. You see that? We're at 44 trillion in July 2025. Let's go to July 2035. 90 trillion. All right, 44 and change went to 90. The trend doubles every 10 years. All right. Rule of 72, the rule of 72 works perfectly at both 7.2% and 10%. So at 7.3%, it means it's going to double in 10 years, the trend. And you see the fiat money will double in 10 years. This is what everybody thinks in terms of bonds, bond managers, stock portfolio managers, hedge fund managers, Wall Street folks, your family office guru who thinks about allocating capital. Everybody thinks in terms of exponential growth. Bitcoin, however, does not grow in exponential over time. It grows in power. You get this concave function, which is very interesting. It's different. To my knowledge, there's no other asset that has ever performed like this. All assets, as far as stocks, bonds, mutual funds, they grow exponentially. It's easier to calculate in your head. I need a 10% growth rate per year to keep ahead of inflation and keep my clients happy or whatever it is. I'm just using round numbers. So what happens to the world, to contracts, if we start to see we assume that everybody's going to adopt Bitcoin, even governments, although I note that the strategic Bitcoin reserve might be losing steam after this big, beautiful bill nonsense. How will contracts be structured? Because you can't have a fixed rate of interest This is the key. If you have a Bitcoin loan denominated in Bitcoin, not denominated in dollars, but in Bitcoin, you can't actually have a fixed percentage Bitcoin loan in sats. You can try to structure it, but that's not how the nature of Bitcoin grows. So, what I've just described just now is a summary of things I've already talked about. You might have a hard time understanding it with money because we're just talking about the growth of money here. All right. I'm substituting this 7.3% as just the cost of capital. How much would it cost for a venture in any general project to keep you ahead of the growth of money? 7.3% per year. So Bitcoin blows everything out of the water right now. As we can see, it's well higher. But at some point, it actually is going to cross back underneath the growth of money. So that's one thing. If this is my main question, and it's kind of a thesis, but if we assume that Bitcoin gets worldwide adoption, as a network does, one of two things would need to happen. Either Bitcoin, as it grows and as it continues to be adopted, will need to morph into an exponential curve where this black line becomes a straight line, just becomes a straight line, and doesn't do this slight decline, or TradFi will need to morph into a power curve where the green line starts to go down. Doesn't need to be parallel exactly, or, I don't know what the ratio is. And I know we're very philosophical here. We're talking decades out. But this will be figured out by Wall Street, by the market. These are two very different trends. And by my estimation of financial history, when two trends collide, one of them is going to dominate. If you looked at the growth of money, again, let's go back and just put the actual money. Let's take off the percentages. Let's take the dominance here. All right, it looks okay. Like, it doesn't really matter. Like, we cross here in early 2040s, we get to 100%, 150 trillion. That's a big stack of TradFi money, central bank money, gold, silver on one side, Bitcoin on the other side. And that still means 50-50, by the way. So Bitcoin's still going to keep growing. And you see that, Bitcoin grows so fast still, even out to the end of the century, that Bitcoin continues to accrete against world money. But I thought about measuring Bitcoin now against other assets that also grow exponentially and see how that looks. So that's what I'm going to show you right now. Let's look at P&G. This is Procter & Gamble. The slope of these curves would change if you change the starting date. But to keep things very simple and basic, I started P&G at the same date as Bitcoin, January 3rd, 2009. What was the market cap of P&G when Bitcoin was zero? 123 billion. P&G, by the way, is an inspiration to this channel's name. Maybe I'll get into it more at some point, but it's a very old company headquartered in my hometown. Been through many different cycles, many different iterations of the company's vision. Started out at 123 billion when Bitcoin started. Now, all right, at clearly exponential growth, it's a straight line on log scale. Where are we right now? $400 billion market cap. Okay. It's not growing that fast. Let's see how fast it's growing. 9%. It's actually growing faster than money, all right? Because remember, money was growing at 7.3%. But because it's a smaller base than the global monetary base, it's not really a problem for Bitcoin, even at 9%. Okay, so if I just layer on Bitcoin, you know what you're going to see. Bitcoin's already passed it. Okay, even at a 9% growth for P&G, all right, the flat dotted line reflects the straight from left, lower left to upper right green line, solid green line. Bitcoin's obviously already bigger than P&G, right? Passed it a couple times, but first in 2017, then dipped below, back up again in 2020, 2021, almost below again 2022, but now thoroughly ahead at $2 trillion. Same thing, Bitcoin growth curve is here. Doesn't really help to look at it, but what we see here is that, again, with the curve, the power curve, which is concave, versus the exponential curve, which is P&G's stock market growth, which you could go all the way back to P&G's founding in the 1800s and still find an exponential flat line growth. It would have a different curve than this, which is 9% per year, but you could still do it. Bitcoin still is firmly ahead of this asset, no problem. But as we know, Bitcoin is not the largest asset, i.e. stock, in the world. Bitcoin's not even a stock. It's money. It's not a stock. That's why I'll always firmly be in this camp that this is comparable to money, world basic money supply. But let's go back now. Okay, so we looked at P&G. What happens when we look at a bigger asset and look at Bitcoin? Perhaps an asset that Bitcoin hasn't passed yet. Here's Apple. Apple market cap. Once again, when Bitcoin started, it was worth $0. Apple was $70 billion. This captures huge growth, by the way, right? Think about Steve Jobs was still struggling health-wise, died in 2011, but he was, Apple was in full iPod mode, moving into full iPhone mode. Super growth, all right? Super big growth, becoming the extremely popular hegemon that it is today. It became the world's largest company, somewhere here, I believe. Passed Exxon at the time. Now remains one of the world's largest companies. So notice the trend. I got to zoom in so you see it. Here's the market cap. Definitely fluctuates. Well below trend. All right. Trend is here. 4 trillion. Apple's market cap's here. 3.2 trillion. Okay. Again, I'm keeping this simple. I'm not saying that Apple's going to 4 trillion in market cap tomorrow. I'm just keeping this simple to grow it out. Okay. I'm using scientific trend lines. At some point, Apple will get back to the trend. One could imagine. They might not, but one could imagine. They've been over trend plenty of times. Here. If you just sort of eye this line, it would be somewhere here. Something like that. If you pull it back to 20. Again, it's we don't have to get too complicated here. This is the Apple market cap. All right, so it grows out. Now let's put Bitcoin. Same thing that we did when we layered on over P&G or TradFi money. This is something we haven't seen before. Same curve. All right, remember here, let's just take everything off, all the noise away. We're comfortably above money and for the next 100 years. P&G already above with the growth rate. It doesn't matter that Bitcoin has this concave down, it's above. But we've now found an asset where Bitcoin does not continue its dominance. I guess I need to self-promote at this point. If you can like, subscribe, follow, I would appreciate it. You will not find this anywhere else on the web. Such a wonderfully presented depiction of exponential growth versus power growth. So I'd appreciate any help. we do pass. All right, it's expected to pass right around the time when it's going to be larger than fiat. Actually, a little bit early. Okay, Bitcoin's going to go up to 17 trillion, 20 trillion by 2033. Again, this is just the trend. It's just the trend. But due to the very solid and large market cap of Apple, by the way, what's the slope of this trend for Apple? We haven't said. Remember, it's going to be a straight line, exponential. It's a whopping 22% per year. All right. And to be clear, if I had pulled this back to the 80s when Apple started and they had big rises and falls, this would be a lower trend line. Okay, so your start date affects this tremendously. But I'm just taking the world as we know it from when Bitcoin started. So it's kind of giving Apple the benefit of the doubt. We'll see. It's a whopping 22% per year. And Bitcoin just stays above it for really like a decade. And then it actually, as Bitcoin is passing base money, which remember is about going to be that 150 trillion a year, it falls back below this powerful exponential trend line of Apple. Apple doesn't move in power. Apple moves in exponential. It moves in a straight line on log scale, both the actual exponential regression, the solid green line, and you'll get a flat, constant year-on-year growth, which is the dotted line. Just like everything else in the world. Stocks, bonds, ETFs, mutual funds. So now it might be an easier way to ask the question. Good morning, Satoto. Thanks for reposting. Appreciate it. I do need more of this. I need to market myself more, I guess, it seems. Let's ask the question again. If people, this shouldn't be that hard to answer, right? If we're still thinking about dollar terms. Good morning, Anders. Good morning. This is the brass tacks question, which I think is very interesting. And we're going to have to understand this if Bitcoin continues on its power trend versus everything else. Either Bitcoin morphs into an exponential trend, which follows sort of the trend line of every other asset, Apple included, P&G, money, or those assets morph into power trends. I don't think it can be true, just based on what I know and based on probably general logic you can imagine too, that these trends could continue indefinitely. Because if they did, obviously you just want to be an Apple. Why would you hold Bitcoin anymore? If, Bitcoin looks much better now, all right? It's growing faster than Apple at 45%. Apple's growing at 22%. But as we know, the growth rate declines on a power curve over time. So here's the first asset that sort of calls into question a lot about the power curve thesis. Not that Bitcoin's not following a power curve. It undoubtedly is. Undoubtedly. But everything else in the world follows an exponential curve. So here it doesn't really matter, even though this is a huge, this is a much bigger stack of dollars, dollar equivalent. Yes, it's yen, euros, yuan, gold, that I get to this 45 trillion. But it's a much slower growth rate than Apple. It's only 7% per year. That's why Bitcoin beats it. Same with P&G. It's both a smaller growth rate, 9% per year on the trend, and a smaller market cap. So Bitcoin has no problem against it. But here with Apple, we've gotten to an asset that challenges that 21 million over infinity meme. Which in my opinion is very interesting. All right, so let's look at the growth rates again. Okay, I'm gonna take off this is the same thing. I have to be on log for this, don't I? Sorry. Log, take this off. Here we go again. All right, so same thing. This looks much I'm not saying Apple's obviously a ubiquitous company. We all probably, many people use products, wear products, and in my opinion, they're going to be around, barring some major issue. But obviously, they can lobby for more power. It's one of the giants in the networking world, no doubt. But they still grow exponential. So remember my cost of capital question. If your return is starting to fall below that of Apple's, and this only happens right about the time Bitcoin will pass money, then why would you hold Bitcoin at this point? Hold Apple. Because it's going to give you a solid 22% per year on the trend. This is the very interesting thing. Yes, the exponential here for Apple is 95% R squared. So it's great fitting trend. Everything's exponential for everything else but Bitcoin. Now, it's not, again, it's volatile. It's a stock market. You see this, again, this jump. This is the trend from July 9th, right? This is the reality. It's a $3.2 trillion company. So, it's more volatile. Even than the monetary trend, remember, is here. Zoom in. Looks much better. You're only a trillion, so to speak, off the trend. Trillion and a half, actually. Sure, you can be way down below the trend, but with gold, with money layered in, it's a pretty solid trend. P&G, by the way, let's just see, non-technology company, also way below trend, but that's the trend. So it's for illustration purposes. But why would you continue to hold Bitcoin if your return is gonna fall? Now, that doesn't mean that that's how the world's going to work. I think it's totally possible that once we get to this point, 2 halvings from now, we're on a SAT standard. People understand that Bitcoin is just so valuable that it sort of forces companies to rethink the way that they operate. But it's not a given. In my opinion, it's not a given. It's not a given. So this is a very interesting thing. Now, Bitcoin doesn't have to be larger than Apple. That's another thing, right? So like gold right now is not larger. Actually, it is larger than Apple, but so gold is. But gold is a $20 trillion asset at today's prices. Asset is a $3.2 trillion asset. So gold is bigger. But hasn't always been at different times. I'm not saying it has to be. But what I do think has to happen is you have to have clarity in how things grow. You have to have clarity in how things scale. And these things scale at fundamentally different ways. Possible. I mean, that's possible one way to say it. I think it's also possible that, as you say, Casper, it's just the nature of growth. My opinion is it's not necessarily the money supply. It's compound interest. It's my opinion. You can find compound interest everywhere. Even in old Greek marketplaces. And so compound interest by its nature is an exponential force. It's an exponential function. So if you had to ask me now, if this was our catch-22 situation, would either Bitcoin go exponential or everything else go power? I would assume that Bitcoin would go exponential. Because it's only one thing that has to change. On the other side, there is this meme, you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you. If Bitcoin remains the ultimate asset, people are still going to want to hold Bitcoin. But there are a few assets that have sort of break the mold, so to speak. And let me put now, this will be interesting, this Bitcoin dominance on linear scale. All right, so I got to take off log. All right, watch this now. Watch this. There it is. This can't happen forever, in my opinion. This is very different than, let's go back to the money one. All right, this is money. Oh, I got to take off log. I got to put them all back and then take off. That's just how it works. There we go. So even though with money, you can see it teeters out, it does way late in the future to sort of not even worry about it. Same with P&G. Actually, P&G a little bit sooner. But this curve is highly interesting, in my opinion. All right, we meet sort of the value of Apple, but then the value of Apple goes away from us. I don't think both things could be true. I think it's fine if they both go up. If we're on a fiat standard, I think it's fine if Apple goes down in terms of Bitcoin on a Bitcoin standard. But if that's the case, then the nature of Apple growing will have to change. It will have to move like the Bitcoin curve. Precisely. That's a good point. Bitcoin remains up against some strong forces that want to go exponential all the time. So I got to be honest, I haven't thought about this as deeply until I got this chart up, Apple market cap versus Bitcoin. It doesn't really seem to bother us if you look at all the gold in the world, all the fiat money in the world, because that stuff is such a high valuation but growing more slowly than Bitcoin that, you know, one would assume we're long on a SAT standard and maybe the world changed into power or Bitcoin changed into exponential. It's less of an important question here. But with Apple, it happens pretty soon on the clock. Only a decade from now, Bitcoin can match it, but then Bitcoin can fall back away. So again, both can go up on a dollar standard, but I don't believe that they can go up like this. Or maybe we don't need money anymore at this point. I don't know. It's just interesting. I'm not speculating more than this. It's just math. Very different. Let's look at Microsoft. Same thing. Microsoft at the moment is slightly more valuable than Apple. All right. ChatGPT fueled is actually overtrend. Overtrend for Microsoft. They're at 3.7 trillion down to 3.5 as a trend line. Same deal. Let's look at Bitcoin. Exact same deal. Exact same deal as Microsoft. All right. Linear scale. This thing actually looks, yeah, it's slightly forward in time for Microsoft. So we get to 100%, again, somewhere early 2030s, but then we're back down to 100% 2041. Here you're back down to 100% 2045. This is a 97% R squared for Microsoft. All right. You got to be a powerful force of nature to change the exponential growth of Microsoft. The slope of this curve is 24%, even better than Apple. Can you imagine? I can't imagine actually that Microsoft outperforms Apple. I do use their products, but they obviously, I'm sure they frustrate me just as much as they frustrate everybody. Microsoft grows at 24% per year in the last 15 years. Compounded, 24% per year. So that is my interesting, hopefully interesting to you, analysis for the day. it is possible that systems can change. My understanding, and maybe you could probably even do a chat GPT on this, my understanding is that it's more likely that a system um, is exponential turning into power versus the other way around. So exponential growth can be fast, or constant at the beginning, but then turn into power as far as like a network or a system grows. But what Bitcoin has done, turning it into exponential, is less common. And I would probably think that would not be a good thing, because then when you have an exponential growth with Bitcoin over time, that will again reflect the rest of what the system is doing. It might be easier for people to calculate. But just mathematically thinking about this, it would be better that the whole system goes into power rather than Bitcoin going into exponential. Because that kind of means like Bitcoin's going back to the status quo. So I don't know if anybody in the power curve or the power law crew has talked about this, if anybody is watching here from there or does watch this. But this would be something to probably hypothesize about and address, because I think this is pretty significant. If the asset is big enough and grows fast enough, then it will pretty easily overtake Bitcoin, as opposed to if the asset's much smaller and grows slower. Then, we don't have to think about this for 50 years. And anyway, it gives time for the system to adjust and people to think in terms of sats. Same with money. Money itself is a huge asset, so to speak, asset. It does hold value. George Selgin said on our first podcast, fiat currencies are stores of value. They're just not very good. So here's this fiat currency valued in dollars plus gold and silver, everything together in one snapshot. It only, quote, only grows at 7% per year, 7.3. So Bitcoin has no trouble overtaking it as it is. Literally, the math checks out. It's no problem. Might crest here at 500% in 2090, but then fall. But Apple and Microsoft show a different story. Apple and Microsoft are networked companies. I think the invalidation of it would be, Daniel, if Bitcoin starts to follow another curve, like an exponential curve. You are right, Casper. They are more unstable in nature. Exponential systems are. Power laws are much more stable growth. As you can see, this asymptotic declining rate where the B is, that's more stable, the black line. And as I said at the top of the stream, my understanding, my rough theory of a lot of financial history is just that. They have grown exponential, and then they've had to reset, whether it's a debt jubilee or an empire falling or a currency being manipulated into its grave and then resetting with a new currency, or the gold standard ending. And this is why I was asking the question earlier, right? So if you're again thinking about your cost of capital, can I look at this on linear to be okay? All right, where do they cross? Yeah, okay, this is fine. More here. Let's do here. All right, so if you're, this is linear now on the right, these percentages. If you're going along here, this is still a while out, but not as long as before. You know? So Bitcoin's still coming down, 45% roughly right now. All right, it's coming down, but it's going to hit that 22% already in the middle of next decade. So if Apple is still on that trend, and I'm not saying they will be, they could be, you know, exponentials can change as far as the slope of the curve. They can fall over a global time frame. That's true. But it's not going to fall. Well, let me say this. Presumably, Apple will still be a big company. All companies do eventually go to zero. That's another point. All exponential models eventually break. So it's possible that Apple could be bankrupt by then, and we don't think about this stuff. But let's say Apple falls to being a lifetime or since 2009 of a 20% instead of 22%, right? Could easily happen there. So that you only have to get to 20%, you only have to wait till 2041. Whereas Apple could have been better by 2038. You see my point? This, you know, exponential growth is powerful as long as it can keep going. I have no idea the answer. All I can tell you for sure is I don't think that these could continue indefinitely on their own structure. They'd have to match up. Thanks, Casper. Yep, that's right. Exponential growth of bacteria. And that bacteria actually may be logarithmic growth, like explosive at the beginning, but then settles down. For sure, the question of how the long term settles is a big question for Bitcoin. A lot of people theorize about it, philosophize about it. Are we going to have debt based societies? Are we going to have interest rates? Are we going to have equity based societies? These are big questions that I don't have an answer to. This is a chart that I wanted to show. My friend Sminston, who's very good with these great power law charts, he's been analyzing, and I guess Giovanni has as well, how MicroStrategy is turning into a power curve against Bitcoin. Not against time, but against Bitcoin. So it seemed more exponential growth, the stock, but now the stock versus Bitcoin here looks much more like power growth, shallower growth. But this is still different. All right, so you see my comment. It's the same stuff that we're talking about. If companies that hold BTC go to power, then all companies that eventually hold BTC will also go to power. I don't think we've actually seen that though here. This is MicroStrategy versus Bitcoin, but we need to look at MicroStrategy versus time. Theoretically, it would be the same ratio because if Bitcoin is power, MicroStrategy is going to power against Bitcoin, then Bitcoin is power in time, then MicroStrategy will also go to power in time. That's interesting. But it doesn't change the question that your cost of capital will then change. You know, you're going to have to do instruments that aren't fixed in the interest rate. And maybe that'll happen. I honestly do not know. Maybe that will happen. If Apple starts to hold Bitcoin and it becomes a large share of their assets and Bitcoin grows in power, then presumably, if Bitcoin is strong enough as an asset, Apple will also grow into power. So that straight line will start bending to this slower, more asymptotic growth. Hello, sir. So that is my question. I would have it. I would put this to the power law folks, to the exponential folks, to people that think Bitcoin is exponential. First of all, you got to show that Bitcoin grows in exponential. It does not. This is an interesting divergence from a large asset. And you see it with Apple, and you see it with Microsoft. Again, when you look at fiat money, it's a shorter growth rate. A smaller growth rate, only 7%, versus Microsoft and Apple, they're growing at 20% plus over the last 15 years. All right. And so even though there's bigger dollars behind fiat money and gold and everything put together, that $44 trillion amount, Bitcoin is pretty easily passes those and even stays above for the next, 100 years or so. But even this, it will fall back down. I talked to Danny on what Bitcoin did about this. I mean, obviously, you just need to know geometry. One is a straight line, the other is a curved line. It's going to pass twice. It's going to pass here, and it's going to pass somewhere. I can't even remember. It's like another 50 years still. It's very slow, but it's going to go back down. And you can see it's already going back down here in this chart. Peaks out at 500 and some percent. Then it's going to go back to 100. So I was never really concerned about this idea, or never thought about it much as it would relate to the traditional financial system. But with Apple and with Microsoft, these are two stocks, and there are certainly more of the bigger companies where this challenges the idea that Bitcoin over, or 21 million over infinity is, what is it? Infinity over 21 million is actually the meme that will play itself out. So the first thing that would invalidate all this is if Bitcoin falls off this power curve, right? Which again, as I've said many times, I don't think is going to happen. I think Bitcoin is a network growing in power, growing over time. So it's going to continue. This adoption is by far and away the most important thing of Bitcoin's growth. It's way more important than ETFs or whatever Donald Trump says. It's just the growth of the network is way more important. Eventually, we get to the monetary stage where we surpass the value of central bank money. All right. And by my basic regression, somewhere the early 2040s, where we get to 100%, and then pass the value of fiat money and gold and silver, all put together. But we still have this question about other powerful assets and other powerful assets that are networks, like Apple, like Microsoft. Their stock price, their growth of their market cap, just like every other company in the world, is exponential. But the scope of their exponential curve, right? 24% per year in terms of Microsoft, faster than Apple at 22% per year, will outlast Bitcoin even during Bitcoin's pump phase, you can say. So that's my question. That's my thesis here. I'm not going to answer. It's more rhetorical. If all of the world in TradFi, stocks, bonds, money is exponential growth, and plus they're going to continue, we know for a fact governments will continue to grow exponentially. We see that the US just passed a bill that's going to increase the deficit, going to increase the debt, 3 trillion. Deficits are not as much over a few years. Debt will probably be even more. That's exponential growth. Bitcoin is the only asset that grows in power, all right, at this more stable network-like growth. I would posit to you that it is impossible that both systems can go on simultaneously. Either one, TradFi moves to power, moves to what Bitcoin does, or two, Bitcoin moves to TradFi and does what TradFi does. But one of those two things would have to happen. So mathematically, when people talk about going to a Bitcoin standard and Bitcoin, your lens of the world viewed for Bitcoin, everything gets cheaper. That can be the case, but that can only be the case if the rest of the world is completely on board with a Bitcoin standard. Otherwise, people will continue to buy Microsoft and buy Apple and grow at a faster rate in dollar terms than Bitcoin. Mathematically, these are the trends. All right, guys, I'm going to have to leave it there today. Too much other stuff to do, but I'll be back tomorrow for more. Keep an eye on this. I think that the top stocks in Bitcoin show that there's something more going on, and Bitcoin's going to have to deal with it. All right, you can find this top monetary assets on my page, on my website. All the top money, central bank money, gold, silver. We look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin sits at number 6 in the world at 2.16 trillion. I do have stocks right here. All right, I do have stocks. Bitcoin as well is number 6 in the world, below Apple, below Microsoft, below Nvidia, below Amazon, below Google. Barely below Google. But these are all exponential assets and they're stocks. They're not money, so they're different. But Bitcoin can't continue to grow differently like them. Something will have to happen to match these curves up. All right, I will leave it there. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Daniel. Take care, everybody.